Most people believe the story of Eve ended with the very first death. They picture her simply vanishing after Adam's last breath, fading into the forgotten pages of history. But what if the end of his life wasn't the end of her story? What if it was just the beginning of her silence? Ancient texts, apocryphal records, and forgotten traditions suggest a different path. A path of grief, isolation, and a purpose forged in sorrow. Join me as we uncover the lost years of Eve, the woman who, for the first time, walked the earth alone. Eve's story didn't end when Adam took his last breath. That moment when the man formed from dust returned to it wasn't the end of the beginning. It was the beginning of her silence. Most people assume Eve simply vanished into obscurity after Adam's death. But ancient texts, apocryphal records, and forgotten traditions suggest otherwise. They describe a woman who lived on in grief, in isolation, and in purpose. A woman who, for the first time, walked the earth alone. But what happened in those lost years? Did Eve continue to speak with God? Did she return to Eden's borders? Or did she wander endlessly through a world now cursed, marked by the blood of her own sons? And if she lived beyond Adam, who buried her? Where was she laid to rest? These questions have haunted scholars and seekers of truth for centuries. And while Genesis goes silent, the shadows of the past begin to speak through hidden writings and ancient whispers. In the Book of Jubilees and fragments of the life of Adam and Eve, there are hints, pieces of a forgotten legacy. They tell us that Eve lived for many decades after Adam's death. During that time, she wept daily at the memory of Eden. She remembered the sound of God's voice, the warmth of divine presence, and the cold silence that came after. Her children grew, scattered, and died. Some followed righteousness. Others, like Cain's descendants, embraced the darkness, and Eve remained, watching a world she helped shape become something she no longer recognized. One ancient tradition says Eve retreated to a sacred hill near Eden's entrance. There she fasted and prayed, refusing food for days, calling upon the Lord to forgive not only her but all her offspring. It's said she marked the days by carving lines into a tree until the tree itself withered under the weight of her sorrow. But no angel came to comfort her. No new garden appeared. Only the wind answered her prayers. Still, she stayed waiting for something. Perhaps redemption or death or a sign that God had not fully forgotten her. Eve's prayers, according to one source, weren't just words. They were confessions. In the Book of Adam and Eve, she is portrayed as mourning, not only for her own fall, but for the ripple effect it caused. She believed the suffering of the world was her burden to carry. Alone, she recounted the moment she touched the fruit, the instant her eyes opened, and how that sight has never left her. The brightness of Eden had turned into shadows in her memory, and she began to write down her regrets, though no scroll has ever been found. But Eve was not entirely alone. Some of her grandchildren, those born from Seth's righteous line, remained nearby. They revered her as the mother of mankind, but also feared the aura of sorrow that surrounded her. They said her eyes carried the weight of heaven's silence, that when she spoke, birds stopped singing, and that at night she often whispered to the stars as if expecting someone to answer back. She had become a living legend among her descendants, a relic of an age when humans walked with the divine. One chilling detail emerges from a Coptic manuscript. It claims that Eve in her final years began having visions not of angels but of a coming flood. She saw water washing away entire cities, drowning the wicked and silencing the corrupted. These visions tormented her, but she understood them as warnings. She begged her family to remain faithful, to resist the growing violence she saw among men. She feared they were walking the same path that Cain began, a path that led away from God and toward destruction. In one of her final recorded statements, Eve is said to have declared, "Let my bones lie in the earth, but may my spirit rise to see Eden once more." It's believed she chose her own burial place, an isolated cave facing east toward the garden she could no longer enter. Some ancient rabbis believe this site was later visited by Enoch, who took a single stone from Eve's grave and inscribed it with a symbol of divine sorrow. That stone has never been found, but legends say it still exists somewhere beneath the ruins of the oldest mountains. There's a lesser-known text often dismissed as folklore that claims Eve's hair turned white not from age but from grief. It happened overnight after a dream in which she stood once again at the gates of Eden. In the dream, the cherubim guarding the entrance didn't speak, but one turned away his face from her. That rejection burned deeper than the flaming sword. When she awoke, her hair was no longer dark, and her heart was no longer at peace. From that moment on, she stopped speaking to her family entirely. Eve became what the texts call a mourner of the first light. She would walk before dawn barefoot, tracing the hills where she once walked with Adam, hoping to see the golden light of Eden break through the clouds again. Some claimed that during these wanderings she was seen speaking to the wind, calling out the name Abel as if hoping to hear it echo back. The pain of losing one son to murder and the other to exile had never left her. She didn't just lose Eden, she lost her family piece by piece. But there's a final mystery surrounding her death. Unlike Adam, whose passing is noted in several apocryphal writings, Eve's death is described in silence. Some accounts suggest she simply laid down under a fig tree and never rose again. Others believe she vanished from her cave one night, and only her sandals remained, pointing toward the east. One Mesopotamian commentary even suggests that she was taken up in a whirlwind, not unlike Elijah, as a divine act of mercy. But none of these versions ever made it into the canon. And then there is the rumor of the final scroll. A fragment found among the Dead Sea Scrolls, still unconfirmed, mentions a mother of nations who left behind a written lament. This lament, if authentic, could be Eve's last testimony. It speaks of a world where fire will purify the earth, where the seed of righteousness will battle the children of darkness, and where the garden will open once more, not to the firstborn, but to the last remnant. Scholars have debated whether this refers to Eve's hope or her prophecy. Some scholars believe Eve's forgotten years were not just years of mourning, but of revelation. As the last witness of Eden, she became a vessel of ancient memory. Certain ancient Christian sects believed Eve received visions similar to those of the prophets. They believed she saw the Messiah, not in name but in promise. That in her final days she spoke of a light from the woman that would crush the darkness born from her own mistake. These visions were passed orally for generations, though most were silenced or destroyed. One Ethiopian manuscript refers to Eve as the first prophetess. It says she was the first to weep for the sins of mankind and the first to foresee their redemption. It describes a moment when a child from Seth's lineage came to her and asked, "Will we ever return to the garden?" And Eve replied, "Not until the serpent is buried under the feet of one born without our stain." That line echoes eerily close to the prophecy of Genesis 3 verse 15, and some believe it was preserved by oral tradition long before the text was written. Even her physical appearance was said to have changed. Writings from early desert mystics suggest Eve became emaciated, almost translucent, her body a symbol of spiritual affliction. They wrote that she ate only herbs and drank dew from leaves. Some thought she was slowly fading, becoming less of the earth and more of the spirit. And when she finally died, the ground around her was said to tremble, and a bright light was seen above the mountain for 3 days. Then it vanished, and so did her memory from scripture, from tradition, from most of history, but not completely. In certain Eastern Orthodox circles, Eve is still remembered once a year, not as a sinner, but as a mother who carried both guilt and glory. Some hymns even call her the gate of sorrow and hope, acknowledging her dual role in the fall and the redemption narrative. And while most of the world forgot what became of her after Adam's death, those who kept her memory alive saw her not as a warning, but as a mirror, a woman broken yet waiting for Eden. Among the Gnostic writings, particularly the Apocryphan of John, Eve is given an elevated role, one far beyond what most traditions accept. She is referred to as a vessel of divine wisdom, a being who carried within her a fragment of heavenly light that the rulers of darkness tried to extinguish. In this narrative, her exile from Eden wasn't just punishment. It was an act of cosmic sabotage. Her continued life after Adam's death then becomes a quiet resistance, a silent war against the forces that feared what she still remembered. Some fragments even suggest that Eve was visited by a celestial being during her solitude. Not an angel, but a radiant figure called the Keeper of the Promise. This being, according to the texts, revealed to her the future lineage that would one day restore what was lost. It said that Eve wept when she heard the name Mary spoken, not fully understanding it, but knowing that something holy would one day come through her bloodline. Whether this was truth, vision, or poetic tradition, it lingers as one of the most mysterious pieces of her legacy. Another obscure passage from the Cave of Treasures suggests that Eve's body was later moved and buried beside Adam by Seth himself. According to this account, their bones were later transported to a sacred mountain which some associate with Golgotha. That same mountain centuries later would be stained by the blood of another. The connection is not lost on those who believe that God's plan for redemption was always tied to the very dust from which mankind came and to the ones who first walked upon it. But perhaps the most haunting tradition is the one that says Eve's final words were not spoken, but carved into stone, into bark, into the earth itself. Short phrases, prayers, regrets, warnings, buried under layers of time, scattered across lands we no longer recognize. And some believe that when the final age comes, those words will be found and her voice will rise again, not in shame, but in glory. The silence of Scripture regarding Eve's final days may not be accidental. Early church fathers debated her role, some revering her as the first mother, others condemning her as the source of mankind's fall. Over time, as patriarchal structures shaped theology, Eve's later years were erased or downplayed, perhaps to preserve a simplified narrative. A narrative where Adam dies with dignity and Eve fades into the background. But the fragments we've uncovered suggest the opposite, that Eve endured far longer, feeling every consequence of her choice with agonizing clarity. There's a tale from ancient Aramaic oral tradition that says, Eve planted a tree in the final year of her life, a bitter tree with twisted branches grown from a seed she had carried from Eden itself. It never bore fruit. It served as a memorial not of paradise, but of the cost of losing it. Some say that very tree stood for centuries, weathered by storm and sun until it finally withered during the days of the flood. If true, it would mean her grief was rooted literally into the landscape of human history. And what of her descendants? Many traditions say that Seth's children preserved her words in secret, passed down through generations, whispered during nights of exile, sung softly as lullabies in lands far from Eden. These words spoke not only of what was lost, but of what could still be reclaimed. A garden not built with walls, but with obedience. A life not free from sorrow, but redeemed through it. Eve's legacy became a paradox. She was the reason we fell and the first to believe we could rise again. As centuries passed, Eve's image shifted. To some, she remained a symbol of failure. To others, especially among mystics and early visionaries, she became something more, a witness, not just to paradise, but to pain, to the silence of God and the distant echo of his return. And in that waiting, in that space between fall and redemption, she became every human heart torn between regret and hope. One Jewish legend tells of a hidden scroll said to contain Eve's final lament. It was supposedly discovered in a cave during the Second Temple period, but was never publicly revealed, hidden again by priests who feared its contents would challenge the prevailing doctrines. According to hearsay, the scroll included not only Eve's repentance, but also a plea to future generations. Do not blame the beginning. Seek the restoration. Those who allegedly read it said her words were unlike anything found in Genesis, raw, poetic, and deeply human. A few early Christian sects in Syria commemorated Eve with a ritual of ashes. On a specific night each year, they would gather outside under the stars, lighting small fires in silence. It wasn't a celebration. It was remembrance. They believed that Eve wandered under the night sky in her last years, speaking to God when no one else would listen. The fires symbolized her prayers rising from the dust. Eventually, this ritual was condemned as heretical and forgotten, but echoes of it remain in ancient liturgies and hymns rarely sung. In the mystical tradition of the Zohar, Eve is described as carrying the wound of light, a paradoxical image representing both sin and divine imprint. It's said that the serpent targeted her not because she was weak, but because she bore a unique spark of God's presence. And after the fall, that spark didn't vanish. It deepened. Her wandering after Adam's death in this view was not just sorrow. It was purification, a sacred exile meant to prepare the ground for a new covenant, one that would come through her distant daughter. Even Islamic tradition preserves a detail often overlooked, that Eve was created from Adam. Yes, but that she was the first to weep. In some interpretations, she wept longer than Adam, prayed more fervently, and was the first to plead for forgiveness. That emphasis on her emotional depth carries into her post-Adamic life. While Adam's story ends in rest, Eve's continues in longing. And that longing left unresolved in most scriptures may be why her story still haunts us, because it feels unfinished. Some say Eve never truly died, that her body may have returned to the earth, but her essence lingers, woven into the soil of the first garden, whispered through winds that pass over forgotten ruins. A few ancient poets believed that every woman who carries both strength and sorrow carries a piece of Eve, and every tear shed in repentance echoes her voice. This idea isn't theology. It's legacy, a spiritual thread connecting the first mother to every generation that came after her. There's a chilling belief found in one early Christian commentary that Eve witnessed the building of the first city by Cain's descendants and turned her back on it. She chose not to enter. She saw their altars, their idols, their weapons, and knew that this was not the world she was meant to inhabit. Instead, she climbed the mountains, lived among trees, and returned to the dust in silence. Her rejection of civilization wasn't fear. It was mourning. And in that mourning, some say she became holy again. In the final verse of an obscure hymn once sung in Aramaic villages, Eve is called the mother of the hidden door. The lyrics speak of a veil that she saw lifted only once just before her death. Behind it, the garden waited, not as it was, but as it would be, restored, renewed, filled with light. And a voice told her, "Sleep, Eve, the promise will come." Whether metaphor or revelation, this vision captures the heart of her forgotten years. A life spent watching, weeping, and waiting for a redemption she would not live to see. But perhaps that's why her story matters. Eve is not just the beginning. She is the waiting, the enduring, the quiet strength of one who bore the weight of the world's first wound and kept walking. Her silence after Adam's death is not absence. It is testimony. A testimony buried by time but never erased. And in a world still longing for Eden, her forgotten years may hold the key to understanding our own. If we listen closely to the voices of the ancient texts, one truth emerges. Eve didn't vanish. She was silenced not by God, but by men, scribes, and centuries of retellings that reduced her to a single act. Her journey after Adam was too complex, too emotional, too sacred, and perhaps too dangerous for traditional history to preserve. And yet, like a hidden seed beneath dry soil, her legacy continues to push upward, breaking through fragments of forgotten manuscripts, oral stories, and the longings of those who still seek her face. One modern scholar proposed a provocative idea that the story of Eve after Adam parallels the journey of humanity itself. Cast out, burdened with memory, yet constantly seeking light, she represents not the fall but the aftermath, the hard road of living with consequence while still clinging to hope. In this reading, Eve is not a villain or a victim. She is the prototype of endurance. And in her forgotten years, we see the pattern of redemption begin to take shape, not through triumph, but through trust. The few surviving words attributed to her in apocryphal texts often center on one theme. I remember. She remembered Eden not as a place of shame, but of purpose. She remembered God's voice not as judgment, but as love that once walked beside her. And she remembered the faces of her sons, even the one who raised his hand in violence. Her memories, however painful, kept her grounded. While the world moved on, building towers, naming cities, waging wars, Eve remembered something older, something purer, and perhaps that was her true calling in the end. To remember what others forgot, to hold on to the vision of a world as it was meant to be, even as everything around her changed. In that sense, Eve became more than a figure of the past. She became a guardian of the first promise. And through her tears, her silence, and her resilience, she carved a path for every soul who has ever longed for home. One ancient Syrian manuscript refers to Eve's final moments not as death but as a return. It says she closed her eyes facing the east and breathed one final prayer. "May the garden remember me." There was no thunder, no divine voice, no flaming chariot, just silence. And yet those nearby claimed the earth grew still for a moment, and even the animals paused. It was as if creation itself recognized that the first mother had finally rested. That silence was not an ending, but a passing of the torch. It is said that Seth, the faithful son, built a memorial of stones near her resting place. He didn't write her name, but marked it with the symbol of a vine representing life that continues to grow despite being cut. That symbol, later echoed in ancient Christian art, became a quiet tribute to Eve's unseen strength. And though her name was left off the stone, those who passed by knew who lay beneath. They whispered her name with reverence, not for her mistake, but for the faith she held long after paradise faded. Centuries later, when questions about the origin of evil, sin, and salvation filled the writings of early theologians, Eve's voice was nowhere to be found. Her story had been reduced to a cautionary tale, stripped of humanity, nuance, and hope. But buried beneath layers of doctrine and silence were the fragments of a different narrative. A narrative where Eve was more than the one who fell. She was the one who remained, who endured the consequences, who mourned, repented, and waited in faith. And maybe that's the greatest truth of her forgotten years. Not what she did, but how she carried it, with the weight of loss, with the ache of memory. And yet, still with eyes turned east, watching for the garden's return, Eve's final gift to humanity may not have been a prophecy or a scroll, but a quiet example that even after Eden, even after loss, even after silence, there is still the possibility of redemption. There is a line preserved in a hymn once banned for heresy. Her breath became the wind that whispers of Eden. It's poetic, yes, but it reveals something profound. While Adam's story ends with burial and finality, Eve's story lingers like the breeze through trees that once lined a forgotten paradise. That line suggests that her presence remains not as spirit or ghost, but as memory embedded in the very fabric of the world. A mother not just of flesh and blood, but of longing, waiting, and sacred grief. Some early believers believed that Eve's soul was the first to be visited by the Messiah after his death. That she who first opened the door to sin would also be the first to witness the opening of the gates of redemption. This belief was not doctrine, but it was devotion. A hope that God in his mercy reached back to the very beginning and whispered to the first woman, "You are not forgotten." Whether or not this happened, the very idea reframes everything we thought we knew about her. And maybe that's why her story was buried. Because to see Eve in full light is to see ourselves, not just as broken, but as beloved. Her forgotten years remind us that redemption doesn't always come quickly. Sometimes it looks like a lifetime of walking through wilderness, praying without answers, remembering what was lost, and still believing in what could be restored. And in that, Eve becomes the silent companion of every soul who has ever waited in the dark for the dawn. So when we ask what happened to Eve after Adam died, perhaps the answer is not found in tombs or texts alone. Perhaps it's found in the unseen places, in old mountains, quiet prayers, hidden scrolls, and the spaces between verses. And maybe, just maybe, her voice still echoes, not in condemnation, but in invitation, to remember, to endure, and to hope. If this truth stirs something deep inside you, don't let it fade. Like Eve, keep looking east, keep remembering,